Professor Richardson, to use her formal moniker, had an illustrious career before starting Letters from an American in 2019. She has taught history at MIT, the University of Massachusetts, and for the last 15 years at Boston College. She's the author of 7 superlative books and is a beloved mentor to her students at Boston College. I got to know Heather early when my youngest son took her first course at Boston College in 2010. He subsequently earned his PhD under Heather's tutelage as they shared a passion for the history of the Civil War and Reconstruction. That was how I received a copy of Heather's book, To Make Men Free, in 2014. The book was simple, historical, and brilliant. I went out and bought 7 copies, which I handed out to friends, including some in high political office, because the book was obviously true and profound. We are here tonight to celebrate the lighting and hanging of the famous lanterns in the steeple of this church. The image of those lanterns is iconic, in part for the practical purpose they served as a signal to Paul Revere. They are also iconic because of the enduring symbolism, a ray of hope in a dark world where scary things were happening. This image of a light in the darkness is found throughout history and literature. Shakespeare in The Merchant of Venice refers to a candle which shines like a good deed in a weary world. Frequent references to a light at the end of the tunnel evoke optimism and looking forward to the end of hardship. There are many references in the Bible to light as a symbol of holiness, goodness, and wisdom. Heather, ensconced now on the coast of Maine, writing her Letters from an American, is like a lighthouse shining its beam through the present darkness. Hope and enlightenment, which we need to remember our history, our roots, and our better angels. Heather is always a treat and a source of light. Let's put our hands together in a warm welcome to a true American.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Ned, not only for that lovely introduction, but for giving me one of the finest graduate students I've ever had. Thank you, too, to the Reverend Matthew Cadwell, who invited me here, and to the vestry and congregation of the Old North Church for having me here, and also to Bishop Whitworth, with congratulations as well. "250 years ago, in April 1775, Boston was on edge. 7,000 residents of the town shared these streets with more than 13,000 British soldiers and their families. The two groups coexisted uneasily. 2 years before, the British government had closed the port of Boston and flooded the town with soldiers to try to put down what they saw as a rebellion amongst the townspeople. Ocean trade stopped, businesses failed, and work in the city got harder and harder to find. As soldiers stepped off ships from England onto the wharves, half of the civilian population moved away. Those who stayed resented the soldiers, some of whom quit the army and took badly needed jobs away from locals. Boston became increasingly cut off from the surrounding towns, for it was on almost an island lying between the Charles River and Boston Harbor, and the townspeople were under occupation. Soldiers, dressed in the red coats that inspired locals to insult them by calling them lobsterbacks, monitored their movements and controlled traffic in and out of the town over Boston Neck, which was the only land bridge from Boston to the mainland, and it was so narrow at high tide it could accommodate only 4 horses abreast. Boston was a small town of wooden buildings crowded together under at least 8 towering church steeples, for Boston was still a religious town. Most of the people who lived there knew each other, at least by sight, and many had grown up together. And yet, in April 1775, tensions were high. Boston was the heart of the colonial resistance to the policies of the British government, but it was not united in that opposition. While the town had more of the people who called themselves patriots than other colonies did, maybe 30 or 40%, at least 15% of the people in town were still fiercely loyal to the king and his government. Those who were neither patriots nor loyalists just kept their heads down, hoping the growing political crisis would go away and leave them unscathed. It was hard for people to fathom that the country had come to such division. Only a dozen years before, at the end of the French and Indian War, Bostonians looked forward to a happy future in the British Empire. British authorities had spent time and money protecting the colonies, and colonists saw themselves as valued members of the empire. They expected to prosper as they moved to the rich lands on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, and their ships plied the oceans to expand the colony's trade with other countries. That euphoria faded fast. Almost as soon as the French and Indian War was over, to prevent colonists from stirring up another expensive struggle with indigenous Americans, King George III prohibited the colonists from crossing the Appalachian Mountains. Then, to pay for the war just passed, the king's ministers pushed through Parliament a number of revenue laws. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, requiring the payment of a tax on all printed material, from newspapers and legal documents to playing cards. It would hit virtually everyone in the North American colonies. But knowing that local juries would acquit their fellow colonists who violated the Revenue Acts, Parliament took away the right to civil trials and declared that suspects would be tried before admiralty courts, overseen by British military officers. Then Parliament required colonials to pay the expenses for the room and board of the British troops who would be stationed in the colonies. That's the law known as the Quartering Act. But what Parliament saw as a way to raise money to pay for an expensive war, one that had benefited the colonists after all, colonial leaders saw as an abuse of power. The British government had regulated trade in the empire for more than a century. But now, for the first time, the British government had placed a direct tax on the colonists without their consent. Then it had taken away the right to a trial by jury. And now it was forcing colonists to pay for a military to police them. Far more than money was at stake. The fight over the Stamp Act tapped into a struggle that had been going on in England for more than a century over a profound question of human governance. Could the king be checked by the people? This was a question the colonists were perhaps uniquely qualified to answer. While the North American colonies were officially governed by the British Crown, the distance between England and the colonies meant that colonial assemblies often had to make rules on the ground. Those assemblies controlled the power of the purse, which gave them the upper hand over royal officials who had to await orders from England that often took months to arrive. That chaotic system enabled the colonists to carve out a new approach to politics, even while they were living within the British Empire. Colonists naturally began to grasp that the exercise of power was not the province of a divinely ordained leader, but something temporary that depended on local residents' willingness to support the men who were exercising that power. The Stamp Act threatened to overturn that long-standing system, replacing it with tyranny. When news of the Stamp Act arrived in Boston, a group of dockhands, sailors, and workers took to the streets, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. They warned colonists that their rights as Englishmen were under attack. One of the Sons of Liberty was a talented silversmith named Paul Revere. Revere had been born in Boston, and he knew the area well. He turned the story of colonists' loss of their liberty into engravings. Distributed as posters, Revere's images would help spread the idea that colonists were losing their liberties. The Sons of Liberty was generally a catch-all title for those causing trouble over the new taxes, so that protesters could remain anonymous, but prominent colonists joined them and at least partly directed their actions. Lawyer John Adams recognized that the Sons of Liberty were changing the political equation. He wrote that gatherings of the Sons of Liberty tinge the minds of the people. They impregnate them with the sentiments of liberty. They render the people fond of their leaders in the cause and averse and bitter against all opposers. John Adams's cousin Samuel Adams, who was deeply involved with the Sons of Liberty, recognized that building a coalition in defense of liberty within the British system required conversation and cooperation. As clerk of the Massachusetts legislature, he was responsible for corresponding with other colonial legislatures. Across the colonies, the Sons of Liberty began writing to like-minded friends, informing them about local events, asking after their circumstances, organizing. They spurred people to action. By 1766, the Stamp Act was costing more to enforce than it was producing in revenue, and Parliament agreed to end it. But it explicitly claimed full power and authority to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever, and it imposed new revenue measures. News of the new taxes reached Boston in late 1767. The Massachusetts legislature promptly circulated a letter to the other colonies opposing taxation without representation and standing firm on the colonists' right to equality within the British Empire. The Sons of Liberty and their associates called for boycotts on taxed goods and broke into the warehouses of those they suspected weren't complying, while women demonstrated their sympathy for the rights of colonists by producing their own cloth and drinking coffee rather than relying on tea. British officials worried that colonists in Boston were on the edge of revolt, and they sent troops to restore order. But the troops' presence did not calm the town. Instead, fights erupted between locals and the British regulars. Finally, in March 1770, British soldiers fired into a crowd of angry men and boys harassing them. They wounded 6 and killed 5, including Crispus Attucks, a black man who became the first to die in the attack. Paul Revere turned the altercation into the Boston Massacre. His instantly famous engraving showed soldiers in redcoats smiling as they shot at colonists, like fierce barbarians grinning o'er their prey, approve the carnage and enjoy the day. Parliament promptly removed the British troops to an island in Boston Harbor and got rid of all but one of the new taxes. They kept the tax on tea, keeping the issue of taxation without representation on the table. Then, in May 1773, Parliament gave the East India Tea Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. By lowering the cost of tea in the colonies, it meant to convince people to buy the taxed tea, thus establishing Parliament's right to impose a tax on the colonies. In Boston, local leaders posted a citizen guard on Griffin's Wharf at the harbor to make sure tea could not be unloaded. On December 16, 1773, men dressed as indigenous Americans boarded 3 merchant ships. They broke open 342 chests of tea and dumped the valuable leaves into the harbor. Parliament closed the port of Boston, stripped the colony of its charter, flooded soldiers back into the town, and demanded payment for the tea. Colonists promptly organized the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and took control of the colony. The Provincial Congress met in Concord, where it stockpiled supplies and weapons and called for towns to create Minutemen who could fight at a moment's notice. British officials were determined to end what they saw as a rebellion. In April, they ordered Military Governor General Thomas Gage to arrest colonial leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who had left Boston to take shelter with one of Hancock's relatives in the nearby town of Lexington. From there, they would seize the military supplies at Concord. British officials hoped that seizing both the men and the munitions would end the crisis. But about 30 of the Sons of Liberty, including Paul Revere, had been watching the soldiers and gathering intelligence. They met in secret at the Green Dragon Tavern to share what they knew, each of them swearing on the Bible that they would not give away the group's secrets. They had been patrolling the streets at night and saw at midnight on Saturday night, April 15th, the day before Easter Sunday, that the general was shifting his troops. They knew the soldiers were going to move, but they didn't know if the soldiers would leave Boston by way of the narrow Boston Neck or row across the harbor to Charlestown. That mattered, because if the townspeople in Lexington and Concord were going to be warned that troops were on their way, messengers from Boston would have to be able to avoid the columns of soldiers. The Sons of Liberty had a plan. Paul Revere knew Boston well. He'd been born there. As a teenager, he'd been among the first young men who had signed up to ring the bells in the steeple of the Old North Church. The team of bell ringers operated from a small room in the tower, and from there, a person could climb sets of narrow stairs and then ladders into the steeple. Anyone who lived in Boston or the surrounding area knew well that the Old North Church steeple towered over every other building in Boston. On Easter Sunday, after the secret watchers had noticed the troop movement, Revere traveled to Lexington to visit Adams and Hancock. On the way home, through Charlestown, he had told friends that if the British went out by water, we would show 2 lanterns in the North Church steeple, and if by land, 1, as a signal. Armed with that knowledge, messengers could avoid the troops and raise the alarm along the roads to Lexington and Concord. The plan was dangerous. Old North Church was Anglican, Church of England, and about a third of the people who worshiped there were Loyalists. General Thomas Gage himself worshiped in that pew back there. But so did Paul Revere's childhood friend, John Pulling Jr., who worshiped over there. He had become a wealthy sea captain and was a vestryman, which meant he was responsible for the church's finances. Like Revere, Pulling was a Son of Liberty. So was the church's relatively poor caretaker, or sexton, Robert Newman, who worshiped there. They would help. Dr. Joseph Warren lived just up the hill from Paul Revere. He was a Son of Liberty and a leader in the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. On the night of April 18th, he dashed off a quick note to Revere, urging him to set off for Lexington to warn Adams and Hancock that the troops were on the way. By the time Revere got to Warren's house, the doctor had already sent another man, William Dawes, to Lexington by way of Boston Neck. Warren told Revere the troops were leaving Boston by water. Revere left Warren's house, found his friend John Pulling, and gave him the information that would enable him, Pulling, to raise the signal for those waiting in Charlestown. Then, Revere rode across the harbor to Charlestown to ride to Lexington himself. The night was clear with a rising moon, and Revere muffled his oars and swung out of his way to avoid the British ship standing guard. Back in Boston, Pulling made his way past the soldiers on the streets to find Newman. Newman lived in his family home, where the tightening economy after the British occupation had forced his mother to board British officers. Newman was waiting for Pulling and quietly slipped out of the house to meet him. The 2 men walked past the soldiers to the church. As the caretaker, Newman had a key. The two men crept through the dark church, climbed the stairs and then the ladders to the steeple, holding the lanterns. A tricky business, but one that a caretaker and a mariner could manage. They very briefly flashed the lanterns they carried to send the signal, and then they climbed back down. Messengers in Charlestown saw the signal, but so did British soldiers. Legend has it that Newman escaped from the church by climbing out that window. He made his way back home, but since he was one of the few people in town who had keys to the church, soldiers arrested him the next day for participating in rebellious activities. He told them that he had given the keys to Pulling, who as a vestryman could give him orders. But when soldiers went to find Pulling, he had skipped town, likely bound for Nantucket. While Newman and Pulling made their way through the streets back to their homes, the race to beat the soldiers to Lexington and Concord was on. Dawes crossed the Boston Neck just before soldiers closed down the city. Revere rode to Charlestown, borrowed a horse, and headed out. Eluding waiting officers, he headed on the road through Medford and what is now Arlington. Dawes and Revere, as well as the men from Charlestown making the same ride after seeing the signal lanterns, told the houses along their different routes that the regulars were coming. They converged in Lexington, warned Adams and Hancock, and then set out for Concord. As they rode, young Dr. Samuel Prescott came up behind them. Prescott was courting a girl from Lexington and was headed back to his home in Concord. Quite late, I might add. Like Dawes and Revere, he was a son of liberty, and he joined them to alert the town, pointing out that his neighbors would pay more attention to a local man. About halfway to Concord, British soldiers caught the men. They ordered Revere to dismount, and after questioning him, took his horse and turned him loose to walk back to Lexington. Dawes escaped, but his horse bucked him off, and he too headed back to Lexington. But Prescott jumped his horse over a stone wall and got away to Concord. The riders from Boston had done their work. As they brought word the regulars were coming, scores of other men spread the news through a system of alarm and muster the colonists had developed months before for just such an occasion. Rather than using signal fires, the colonists used sound, ringing bells and banging drums to alert the next house that there was an emergency. By the time Revere made it back to the house where Adams and Hancock were hiding just before dawn on that chilly, dark April morning, militiamen had heard the news and were converging on Lexington Green. So were the British soldiers. When they marched onto the Lexington town green in the darkness just before dawn, the soldiers found several dozen Minutemen waiting for them. An officer ordered the men to leave, and they began to mill around, some of them leaving, others staying. And then, just as the sun was coming up, a gun went off. The soldiers opened fire. When the locals realized the soldiers were firing not just powder, but also lead musket balls, most ran. 8 locals were killed and another dozen wounded. The outnumbered militiamen fell back to tend their wounded, and about 300 regulars marched on Concord to destroy the guns and powder there. But news of the arriving soldiers and the shooting on Lexington Town Green had spread through the colonists' communication network, and militiamen from as far away as Worcester were either in Concord or on their way. By mid-morning, the regulars were outnumbered and in battle with about 400 militiamen. They pulled back to the main body of British troops still in Lexington. The regulars headed back to Boston, but by then, militiamen had converged on their route. The regulars had been awake for almost 2 days with only a short rest, and they were tired. Militiamen fired at them not in organized lines, as soldiers were accustomed to, but in the style they had learned from indigenous Americans, shooting from behind trees, houses, and the glacial boulders littered along the road. This way of war used the North American landscape to their advantage. They picked off British officers dressed in distinct uniforms first. By that evening, more than 300 British soldiers and colonists lay dead or wounded. By the next morning, more than 15,000 militiamen surrounded the city of Boston. The Revolutionary War had begun. Just over a year later, the fight that had started over the question of whether the king could be checked by the people would give the colonists an entirely new, radical answer to that question. On July 4th, 1776, they declared the people had the right to be treated equally before the law, and they had the right to govern themselves. Someone asked me once if the men who hung the lanterns in the tower knew what they were doing. She meant, did they know that by that act they would begin the steps to a war that would create a new nation and change the world? The answer is no. None of us knows what the future will deliver. Paul Revere and Robert Newman and John Pulling and William Dawes and Samuel Prescott and all the other riders from Charlestown who set out for Lexington after they saw the signal lanterns in the steeple of the Old North Church were men from all walks of life who had families to support, businesses to manage. Some had been orphaned young, some lived with their parents, some were wealthy, others would scrabble through life. Some, like Paul Revere, had recently buried one wife and married another. Samuel Prescott was looking just to find one. But despite their differences and the hectic routine of their lives, they recognized the vital importance of the right to consent to the government under which they lived. They took time out of their daily lives to resist the new policies of the British government that would establish the right of a king to act without check by the people. They recognized that giving that sort of power to any man would open the way for a tyrant. Paul Revere didn't wake up on the morning of April 18, 1775, and decide to change the world. That morning began like many of the other tense days of the past year, and there was little reason to think the next 2 days would end as they did. Like his neighbors, Paul Revere simply offered what he could to the cause: engraving skills, information, knowledge of a church steeple, long-standing friendships that helped to create a network. And on April 18th, he and his friends set out to protect the men who were leading the fight to establish a representative government. The work of Newman and Pulling to light the lanterns, exactly 250 years ago tonight, sounds even less heroic. They agreed to cross through town and to light 2 lanterns in a church steeple. It sounds like such a very little thing to do. And yet, by doing it, they risked imprisonment or even death. It was such a little thing, but it was everything. And what they did, as with so many of the little steps that lead to profound change, was largely forgotten until Henry Wadsworth Longfellow used their story to inspire a later generation to work to stop tyranny in his own time. What Newman and Pulling did was simply to honor their friendships and their principles and to do the next right thing, even if it risked their lives, even if no one ever knew. And that is all anyone can do as we work to preserve the concept of human self-determination. In that heroic struggle, most of us will be lost to history, but we will, nonetheless, move the story forward, even if just a little bit. And once in a great while, someone will light a lantern, or even 2. that will shine forth for democratic principles that are under siege and set the world ablaze. Thank you.
Professor Richardson, for many of us here tonight, you are a lantern bearer. You shine the light, now I'm going to cry. You shine the light on our history and our present, challenging as they can be, with a brilliant clarity and words of hope. Thank you. On behalf of the vestry and congregation of the Old North Church, we are pleased to present to you this 250th anniversary lantern with our deepest gratitude. Thank you for your courage, honesty, and commitment to our nation and its very best ideals, so exemplified in the history of this church and in the story of those first lantern bearers and all who saw through the clouds to bring hope and a new way. We are blessed by you.